Okay, our next speaker is Jeff Polenske, and he's been a city engineer for 18 years in Milwaukee. He's going to talk about the new streetcar. Is it a system or just one line?
Small system.
Small starter system in Milwaukee. He told me that he's been involved with practically all 18 years with the city in trying to bring this to fruition. So um, he's a bicycle advocate, big into multimodal transportation, and so he's going to look at all of that from the streetcar and all of the work that he's done, uh, playing a role into bringing it in. So let's hear from you.
All right. All right, well, we're in the last session of the day here, and you're probably not going to find another session like this, going from the freeway, highway discussion to streetcars. So hopefully it'll keep it interesting for you all. So again, yeah, I'm Jeff Polenske. I'm the city engineer for the city of Milwaukee. We've been developing this project, or some version of an improved transit route or system for the city of Milwaukee for well over 20 years. As was said, I've been involved for a good part of that. We've branded our streetcar the Hop, and we'll take a look a little bit more here at what it looks like. Whoops. All right, too quick. So this is our first vehicle that we received. It's a modern vehicle. It's not the heritage lines that once were operating back in the 40s and 50s in Milwaukee. It is a very modern vehicle. The vehicles themselves were actually manufactured in Brookville, Pennsylvania, a little north of Pittsburgh. And so the Hop is about making connections. Some of this is a little bit of a marketing pitch or marketing presentation, but gives you a little perspective on why we're doing this. It's connecting to the places we want to go, to each other, or to a more vibrant urban community, and Milwaukee move forward. So today because I don't know that everybody is necessarily familiar with streetcars, kind of want to go through the what, where, when, and why aspects of the project, and then get into a little bit of the, it's a little bit different than your access management that you might find on a highway. And from our perspective, we're trying to broaden the access that people have to the many different things you have within the central business district. But there are some very site-specific, intersection-specific things that we've had to do, and we'll talk a little bit about that as a part of the Hop Smart initiative, which is really kind of a public outreach, public campaign to help motorists, bicyclists, pedestrians better understand kind of the new conditions that they'll encounter along the route. So what are we building? As you saw before, it's a modern fixed transit system. This is a starter route. It is a small route that will be operating in the central business district. It's electrically powered. It's on rail, and the intent is to expand it over time. The vehicles themselves, 67 feet long, 8 feet 8 inches wide, can accommodate. Actually, probably can accommodate up to closer to about 150 people in maximum capacity. But like a streetcar vehicle, like light rail vehicle, many of the people are standing versus sitting. Typically, they're shorter trips with a streetcar. There's 2 doors on either side of the vehicle, so we actually have stops that are center street stops, also curb side stops. And it provides a level boarding so that people in wheelchairs or parents with strollers, people with bikes can kind of roll on the vehicle a lot easier than having to step up in your typical bus. Just kind of an example of a rendering of what the stops themselves will look like. They're it's a fairly low tech. I mean, it's a higher curb to help provide for that level boarding. We will have some information as to when the next arrival of the vehicle will be coming at the stations themselves. And again, there'll be some that'll be center to the street and some that'll be curbside. Operations, we're looking at 5 a.m. To meet that first Amtrak trip going out of the intermodal station, and until midnight during the weekdays, and it'll change a little bit on the weekends. Whoop. So where are we building the first line? The first initial line is the blue line here. That's the main line. As I had mentioned, let me see if I can get, this is the intermodal station where Amtrak operates. Also a number of regional bus lines operate there. It'll kind of go over to the historic 3rd Ward, which is kind of the shopping district, a lot of residents. Up through the center, employment center, just east of the Milwaukee River in the downtown area, and then up to the lower east side, which is fairly high density residential neighborhood. First line, and then we also have started this lakefront extension, which will operate as a second line, a short second line to the lakefront. That is something that it's not contingent, but it's the schedule is contingent on the development that's taking place right at the edge of the lakefront, and a location that we're actually going to be going through the development, directly through the development. You'll get a picture of that here later on. We're also applying for, and hopefully soon we'll be developing another extension up to where the new Bucks Arena is being built, providing connection to all the development opportunities up there, where we actually took down many years ago. There was a freeway spur that came across the north side of the Central Business District that was removed and is providing a lot of opportunity not only for the Bucks Arena, but also other development that's taking place. So we want to make that connection. We're also looking further into the future to provide connections into the nearby neighborhoods of the Central Business District. There's a study going on currently that will hopefully set us up for another application into the typical capital improvements program that the federal government has. And ultimately having a fairly sizable system that not only connects to nearby neighborhoods, but also we have Marquette University just west of the downtown, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee to the north of the downtown, and then the airport to the south of the downtown. Construction is pretty much complete outside of what we have to do to finish up on the front line. We have 2 vehicles. Third vehicle is coming hopefully next week. 4th and 5th vehicle will be coming in August. And all of this, all the training, all the testing should be completed so that we can open up here sometime this fall. Why are we building this? A comprehensive transportation strategy that we've had for some time. It really is, trying to get everybody into the downtown that works in the downtown via automobile is not a very efficient way, an effective way to operate within an urban city. We do need transit. We need other ways to get around. We need to make good connections. We have an awful lot of on-street parking and off-street parking. We have a parking management system that provides direction to that, and now we're offering through the streetcar connection to that parking, kind of expanding the access to that parking so that you don't have to necessarily drive directly to where your destination is. Providing connection to the bike share system that we have, the existing bus operations, and then as I mentioned, the intermodal station, Amtrak, other regional buses coming into the downtown. Economic development is a really big piece of this as well. We're making a huge investment in the downtown with the streetcar project, and we are starting to, and it has been, this is something that has been shown in other communities that have invested in fixed rail transit, is that the economic development does take place in and around that route. We are starting to see that. I mentioned before, on that lakefront line, this is the Couture. It's a high-end apartment complex, 40-story high-end apartment complex that's expected to start construction this fall. with the idea that, not the idea, but with the plan to have the streetcar actually come right through the podium, not only providing access for those residents to that tower, but also direct access to Summerfest grounds, to the lakefront and the many attractions that you have right there at that location. A number of developers are starting to recognize the benefit of the properties along the route. BMO Harris Bank in the Central Business District is building a new tower right next to one of the streetcar stops. The developers themselves are starting to talk about that not necessarily being the only reason why they're developing it, but certainly it is something that they're putting in the mix of their considerations. This in particular was just announced. This is a very underutilized building, 8-story building has been vacant for many, many years, was just purchased, and it was purchased specifically because it is on the streetcar line. So it was really good news to see that happen. So we'll move on a little bit here to the kind of the route access and operation aspects of things, and some of the public outreach and education that we're having to go through to just get people to better understand what it is that we're building and how, what they're going to see on the route. So, just as in many other cities around the country, around the world, streetcars, it's kind of a level of transit, fixed rail transit in and of its own. It does operate in the street with other vehicles. It operates alongside, the automobiles, the buses, the trucks, the bikes. It can, and we do have a few segments where we're operating in an exclusive lane, and that's where that kind of comes into play, is getting the vehicle out of those exclusive lanes into the shared portions in a safe manner. And we do have to do some specific things to accommodate that. But in general, the typical rules of the road apply. We are going through this campaign effort to better familiarize people with the operation of the streetcar. But it's not just the people who are using the roadway that we have to familiarize with the streetcar. It's also the people that are doing work within the public way. So it's your utility workers, it's the people who own the buildings adjacent to the route, and all the activities that they have to do in managing their buildings and operating their buildings and maintaining their buildings. We have to familiarize them with how they now will continue to do that with the systems that we've put in place, whether it be the overhead wires, the track work, the poles, and the signal systems. So there's a certification process that we will be going through, and there's a lot of standard operating procedures. There's a lot of emergency operating procedures that we have to go through as well. As a matter of fact, our police department, fire department, and a number of the utilities went through their first training exercise for particular scenarios that could potentially happen in an emergency type situation. So very basic. Many of the messages are very basic and just kind of, yeah, we learned this in driver's ed when we were 16. But it's, it really is kind of a reminder to people, what they need to be paying attention to, what they need to be considering. You need to be stopping at the stop bars that we put in place along the routes, because that defines that dynamic envelope that the streetcar needs to follow and have a clear path to make its passage down the route. So here's just an example of kind of the situation where we actually, and it doesn't show up real great, but there's this little signal back here that actually provides a streetcar specific signal. So you get a vertical bar and a horizontal bar, and the vertical bar basically at that time allows the streetcar to make its movement, a turning movement, in advance of any of the vehicles coming through that intersection. So it's these kinds of scenarios. Obviously, as I mentioned, one of the things that I'm sure many of you notice as well, I mean, motorists don't necessarily always follow every rule of the road or every pavement marking that you have on the ground to a T. So it is important for us to help people recognize the importance of this moving forward along the streetcar route. This is one that is going to be a little bit of a challenge, I think, for us, but we are going through a pretty good level of public education on this. But these markings here, you've got your center line, you've got the line that's defining the parking line, and we have to have everybody who's parked along the streets to have every piece of their vehicle inside those white lines. If there's a mirror that's extending out over that outer edge of that white line, that is in the dynamic envelope of the streetcar, and then that operator has to stop and has to go through a certain procedure or protocol to continue to move on to get that vehicle moved. We have very few locations that are less than, most of our parking lanes are, we've tried to maintain 8.5 to 9 feet. There are a couple locations where we run into problems with delivery trucks and that sort of thing, and we've had to make some special accommodations, which I'll show you there as well. So this will be an interesting education of the public here. We are going to be operating probably in another week on the full route, and that'll be kind of the starting point of that education. And ultimately, there is a citation. You know, if you can't get people to comply, obviously they can be cited for blocking the roadway. This is a location, actually, this is Jackson Street, and it's on the backside. There's a not public market, but the Metro Market, a grocery store that is right here, and they get all their deliveries from behind here. And typically there is a loading dock here, but the trucks come in when they come in, and you can get you know, a pretty good string of trucks there trying to deliver what it is that they're delivering. And so we, versus having them deliver and stop in the parking lane, which we didn't have space for, we've accommodated a space which will operate for that two-way turning movement, left turn turning movement to driveways there, but also give them a space that they can actually stop and perform their deliveries from the center of the street. And we did go through this during the construction phase, and it actually worked very well. So it's something that the market has been working with us very closely on to make sure that their motorists are in compliance. This isn't showing up too great, but here we have a fairly low ramp, and where the overhead wires are going, we need to keep, this is an exclusive streetcar lane, but we also need to keep semi-trucks out of that lane because of the low nature of the infrastructure there. So you can't really see it here in the approach, but the approach is certainly lined up to better direct the typical traffic to the vehicular lanes. And we are trying to outline the posts, that designated lane with posts and pavement markings. And so far we haven't had any issues with it, but there's some pretty crazy things that I've seen in Milwaukee with railroad bridges and trucks trying to get underneath them. So we definitely don't want that to happen here. Pedestrians, again, very, very typical messages that we need. I mean, this is a large vehicle. It has less of a stopping distance. It's not much different than your buses and trucks that might be operating on the street. So it's really kind of reinforcing kind of the rules of the road and helping people understand. Cyclists, there are some unique aspects to having rail on the road. It's somewhat similar to, I bike commute to work every day. I've been, faced with a lot of different predicaments, a lot of different things in the roadway that you have to be aware of and you have to manage around. And we've built one more thing that we have to make sure that people understand how to best accommodate, their cycling paths over tracks. So we encourage people to cross the tracks at as close of a 90-degree angle as possible. You want to be as upright as possible when you're crossing the tracks, especially when if it's raining out, a little wetter. And practice two-state. If you're not comfortable as a cyclist, or as skilled, I guess, of a cyclist, and be able to cross the tracks in certain lesser angles. We're trying to encourage them to practice that two-stage turn, which I think was talked about earlier today in another session. There we go. So some of the things that we're doing on the street to help encourage people to do that is we are putting in pavement markings, try to encourage the 90-degree crossing. We do where we have some stops on the curb, along the curb line to prevent cyclists having to be pushed out into that track zone. We're bringing them up through the backside of the station and through pavement markings. Obviously this is a pedestrian crossing, so through pavement markings and some signage here, encouraging cyclists to slow down and yield the right of way to the pedestrian. Here we do have parallel bike lanes, a buffer bike lane along the streetcar. This is a shared lane, streetcar, motorist lane. On Broadway, we have a southbound movement. Milwaukee, a block over, we have the northbound movement of the streetcar. But on this particular street, there's a number of parking structures, which you see one here. There's another one up on this block as well, and I think there's one even further down here. But one of the things that we really felt was important to prevent a lot of the turning movements that take place, especially during the peak times, and to interfere with the operation of the streetcar, we did build this median here, and it took a pretty good amount of convincing, I guess, of some of the parking structures that this was the right thing to do. I mean, obviously a parking structure operator, they want to have full and complete access to their structure. So taking away one or two movements from them can be a difficult discussion. But we did get there. And in general, it's operating pretty well. I will say, though, that the bike lane has become a little bit of a problem because motorists just simply aren't following the fact that the lane is there. So we're looking at an alternate to having the lane there and actually putting in a second lane to better accommodate vehicles that are coming out of these structures. And the bike lane will actually go to an adjacent north-south street, and we're going to be building our first, hopefully be building our first cycle track, two-way cycle track adjacent to this. So it shouldn't be too much of a loss. And as I talked about before, I mean, obviously every property owner that is along the streetcar line, they have things that they have to do to manage and operate their buildings. And so, we've put in place basically a weekly training period that individuals can come out and go through kind of a streetcar familiarization class. For those who are actually doing the work in the public way or adjacent to it, there is a certification process that they would have to go through before they can get a permit to do that work. But we're trying to make it as simple as possible. We are actually going out to many of those building managers as groups, so they don't have to necessarily come to us. So at least they become familiar with it. But once, I think early on in all of this, there were a lot of fears that this was going to, it's going to create problems for our police and our fire and the many buildings and operations that take place. And once you kind of set the standard operating, get the operating procedures in place, get the emergency operating procedures in place, people become very proficient in how they need to accomplish something. And it no longer is seen as something that's inhibiting them from getting whatever it is they need to get done. I know the training exercise that we went through this morning went very well. Had to do with fighting fires on some of the taller buildings that are along the route. But everybody seems to be on board now. We've visited some of the other communities that have streetcars, learned some of the best practices that they have. But there should be, it's just another piece of infrastructure, but the access and operation is still there. The future of streetcars is looking good when it comes to that overhead contact or overhead catenary system, the power lines. One of the things that we have with our vehicles, we have an onboard energy system. And that really actually started because our operation maintenance facility is built directly under directly under I-794. And one of the conditions that that we had for building there was to not have any of those overhead wires, so that obviously you have freeway structure above you. They need to be able to inspect that. Relatively new freeway structure, but it's something that they needed to have full access to be able to inspect that structure. So there are no wires on our operation maintenance facility. The vehicles themselves, again, have that onboard energy system, batteries. Once they get into the facility, we have the charging stations for them to be able to charge up overnight. And what that did is that gave us then the ability to look at the rest of the route and see where we could go off-wire, which is providing some benefit to those adjacent routes. So these portions of the route in purple are those where we're off-wire. And the vehicle goes off-wire at a stop. So there's what they call a pantograph that goes up off the vehicle. It touches the wires, and that's where it connects with the overhead contact. And then when they get to a stop, they have to lower that to go off-wire, and then raise it at the next stop. So our hope is that this is going to be something that's going to not only be successful with the first operation here, but it is something that hopefully is going to improve over time. Detroit has a very similar system and they've been operating actually even in sections where they have the overhead wire, they're operating without it, just to see how far that technology will take them. Our hope is that where we had that low point under the freeway here, that we can actually go off wire at that location at some point in time. But we've got to kind of see how it operates before we can actually take those measures. So I guess with that, I'd like to open up to questions.